Tacoma, Washington, and I graduated from high school in Tacoma. Went to the U of O journalism school. I graduated with a BS degree there in 1965. I did a year of graduate work, and during that year I was editor of the Emerald, 1965-66. Didn't get a master's degree, but I did a year of coursework. Then I came to the Salem Capital Journal, the former afternoon paper here. It was the first newspaper job I had in 1966 when I left the campus. I worked there for a year. I then went to Washington, D.C. for a fellowship for 5 months that I'd actually applied for when I went to college. Then I came back after that and continued to work for the Capital Journal for a year. My father died in Portland, and I was out of the business for a year taking care of some business stuff that he had up there that family needed to deal with. Then I was looking for work again, and the editor of Statesman called me, and I came back to Salem and went to work for the Statesman. I worked there for 7 years, 6 of them here at the Capitol. So that leads up to when I got to the Capitol. Started 1970 at the Capitol with the Statesman. Worked there for 6 years before joining the Associated Press. I like to write. Kind of came naturally to me. I did creative writing, and I guess since I can remember in school. I didn't work on the paper in high school or whatnot, but I was pretty good in English and took a lot of writing courses. When I got into college, I decided I probably wanted to pursue journalism, and the U of O had a good journalism school. And when I got there, I started working the Emerald student paper, and I worked there the whole time I was in school, and I just got really into it. Enjoyed it a lot. Kind of the excitement and variety of it. It's business is never boring. Changes all the time, every day. That's kind of how I got in the business. I was here for 6 years with the Statesman, and then I was with the AP for 29 years. Most of that time in the Capitol, I worked about a year and a half in the Portland office in the midst of that time, so around 34 years in the Capitol altogether. I've been in 4 different press rooms. They're all in the basement. We started out at the west end of the building, and that wasn't big enough, and the building wanted different offices there, so they decided to put us at this end. But before that was completed, we were actually in room 50 for a while. Both wire services and the newspapers were in there until they finished this. Then we were at one time all in this room over here until they moved some over across the hall. It's always been in the basement of the building. I actually started out covering government. The Capital Journal had me covering Polk County Board of Commissioners and city councils in Dallas and Monmouth and Independence, things like that. And so I got sort of interested in government, and then when I went to the fellowship in Washington, D.C., that was government, of course. We had seminars half-time, and we worked half-time, and I worked for a columnist who wrote for columns for some Northwest newspapers on things going on in D.C. that related to this region. And then so I got an interest in government and politics. It sort of fascinated me, and got deeper and deeper into it. And when the beat came open on the Statesman, I jumped at it and lobbied for it. And I still find politics really interesting. I just find the legislature really interesting. I know reporters that don't find government very interesting, but I've always enjoyed it. From a a journalistic perspective, it's may sound a bit corny, but I think it's a noble cause. I think it's the press's core mission to tell the people what the government's doing and what it's not doing. I think that's what the founders had in mind during that era, and so I feel like if I help some people understand what's going on here in their government, I served a purpose. Plus, it takes a while to understand the political system and how politics operates, and I found that as I got into it more years, I think I understood it more, and the machinations of it and the give and take of it and how it works, and I just got kind of fascinated with it, and like trying to figure out how it operates. The public doesn't get that much of a view of it. They don't get on the inside of it very much. There's a pretty dramatic difference in how you operate. During the legislative session, you come in and size things up in the morning, look at the calendars and see what committees have got interesting things going on. You've always got usually a press conference or two, sometimes more on the schedule. When it gets later in the session, you get floor sessions. Of course, you have to juggle those, and see if there's bills you're interested in either house and covering. So you juggle all those things and set priorities, and decide what you're going to do. There were 3 of us here for the AP during the sessions, and 2 in between. So we kept busy every day, just juggling the priorities. And then, of course, unexpected things would happen occasionally. There's always the governor's possibility of announcement or some other official. So you have to set priorities in what you're going to cover. And the AP relies on its member newspapers and broadcasters, too, so we juggle with them on what they're going to cover and kind of exchange, because we serve all of them. In between the legislative sessions, if you want to know about that, it's a lot different because you don't have the hubbub of activity that you do during the most legislative days. You pay more attention to the state agency news, governor's announcements and news, give more attention to covering things like arguments in the appellate courts on cases that you might pass up during the legislature if you had something more pressing. But you're actually doing a little bit more of original looking for news, or looking at your stack of ideas you've piled up, and for days when it's slow. Well, in the legislature period, it's the opposite. You have more than you can do usually, and you tend to do more features, long-term projects, and things you spend a few days on rather than just one day to the next. I think Atiyeh was one of our best governors, and he was one of the best for the press. Tom McCall was certainly a good governor and a visionary. Tom had an ability, maybe because he came out of the media, to communicate and take ideas and communicate them to the public and sell them. And he actually took a lot of other people's ideas and sold them as his own, which politicians do, and that's fine. But actually, Vic Atiyeh was the most accessible governor to the press, even including McCall. Atiyeh would come and visit the press room. Atiyeh would return calls at night personally if we had something pressing, and we'd call him after hours, and that's pretty unusual. So I think Atiyeh was a visionary too. He told people that the property tax limit measures weren't a good idea, and it wasn't a good idea to give back the kicker money in the late 70s. And they started doing that, and that's come back to haunt the legislature and kind of strapped them financially or restrict them financially. As far as legislators, I was interviewed the other day by somebody else. I think the most influential legislator in the time I've been here was Jason Bowe, the first four-term Senate president. He was a Democrat, and he it kind of ran the place. He had a lot of influence, and he really cared about the legislature, and he engineered a lot of improvements. He's really the one that got the wings built on the Capitol. He got champion ballot measures that had the Senate confirm appointments and then let the legislature meet, call itself into session if it wanted to. And during that period, the Dick Eyman, the former House Speaker who just passed away, was another influential legislator, and they set up the Revenue Office and expanded year-round staffs and really made the legislature more equal with the other branches. Jason was stood out to me. I think Peter Courtney will probably leave us a big mark himself. He cares a lot about the process and tries to improve it. Gets very frustrated, but Peter's probably the reason that mental health has a parity now with in insurance with physical health. And when he gets hold of a cause, he's very stubborn and goes after it, and he goes after causes that affect, so to say, the common people. House Speaker Vera Katz was, I think, admirable for things she did. She got the school reform laws passed in 1991, which are still somewhat controversial, but were sort of landmark legislation at the time. She also got a bill passed making handgun permits more uniform and putting some more teeth in background checks for those, which nobody thought could be done politically in Oregon, which is the state where you don't get gun restrictions passed. Very hardworking when she was here. I think the most progressive and significant legislation that passed during my time here, passed in the early 70s, the 71 and 73 sessions. The 73 session especially passed the land use bill. It's still obviously a very hot topic now because of ballot measures to change it in court battles over it. First bill of its kind, obviously, in the country, the first law of its kind. It took a lot of work. You interviewed Ted Halleck. Ted Halleck was instrumental in that, along with Hector McPherson. And they worked on that together for a year or so before the bill was even introduced. And of course, Tom McCall helped get it passed and used his influence, but that was very dramatic. In 73, in 73, they passed the law to create collective bargaining for public employees. They passed the law to decriminalize possessing a small amount of marijuana. I believe that's the session that the open meetings law passed. One of those two sessions, the open records law passed, which arguably is full of loopholes now, but in 71 the famous bottle bill passed, first of its kind in the country. So those were the first two sessions I covered, so maybe I was more impressionable, but Still, I think more progressive legislation passed, more significant and novel legislation passed in the early 70s than have since. And I don't, it'd be hard pressed to explain why that is, but it's the way the politics ebbs and flows. I remember when we ratified the equal rights, the 18-year-old vote in 1971. That was pretty dramatic. There was a big fight in the Senate over it. The Democrats and Republicans were split on it. The Democrats walked out and had a fuss about it at one point. Finally, it passed with the help of a Republican senator from Eugene, who joined with them to pass it. As I recall, it was just one vote. Passed it. That was in 71, my first session. That was the last session run by a coalition in the Senate. The Republicans elected a Democrat as president, John Burns. Oregon's had a lot of other significant legislation, but I think that's the most profound period I can think of. Of course, we've passed other laws like the assisted suicide law that's pioneering and obviously still sort of up in the air in the U.S. Supreme Court. One story I worked on that had to do with the state government but not the legislature that I really got interested in. There was an old woman named Adeline Holloman who was accused of murdering the mayor of Granite, which is a town in eastern Oregon with about 10 or 15 people living in it. She and her daughter and a man were accused of the murder of this guy who was also a reserve sheriff's deputy. Anyway, the angle of the story was she contacted me, and she'd been held in the state hospital without a trial for 5 years. And so I got into that and got a bunch of psychiatric reports and talked to psychiatrists and people and did a lot of work on it. And wrote a lengthy story that our National Wire actually used. It was really interesting to me anyway, and she got a trial. I don't know, it was probably not totally because of me, but I think it helped. I was going through some clippings the other day, and it was on the front page of the Oregonian and whatnot. And she got a trial and got convicted and went to prison. I think she's out on, released on parole now, but that was an example of digging into a government story that may be an example of where somebody'd fallen through the cracks and it's been kind of shuttled off and overlooked. The most dramatic thing I ever covered was a prison riot here, and I wasn't really covering the Capitol. I was working for the Capitol Journal. It happened in 1968, I think. 1968. They set the prison on fire, part of it, and took a bunch of hostages and said they were going to cut one head off every hour until they got their demands. They didn't do that, but we sat inside all night in the prison, locked in the prison. Obviously, you're always locked when you go in there, with smoke, water on the floor, and smoke in our eyes, and they negotiated with these guys. And the guys pretty much gave up. There wasn't a lot of negotiating in the end, but they beat up a couple of guards. Nobody got killed. But that was a pretty dramatic thing for a young reporter to go in there with these. I remember the side of the state police pulling out billy clubs out of these boxes and heading in there. And I thought, I'm going to go in there, get locked in there for the night, but I did. And the Statesman Journal reporter was Ron Blankenbaker, so we were kind of competing against each other on that story. And that was the days when the Senate president became governor. As you know, Debs was governor quite a few days total. But McCall was out of state, and so Debs had to go out there and try to manage things. But obviously that was pretty dramatic. Another dramatic thing, when I worked for the Statesman, the state police superintendent got shot to death in front of the public service building, 1975, I think. Big deals at the legislature. There've been a few walkouts and things like that. The first one in 71 over the voting, 18-year-old vote amendment. President John Burns locked everybody inside, including the press, so we couldn't get out for an hour or two. That was pretty strange. I thought, well, this place operates really weird. It was interesting political times in the 70s when we tended to get more nationally known people to the Dorchester Conference and things like that, Nelson Rockefeller and Ronald Reagan and people. Those were good experiences. I think of, for some reason, I think of a couple mistakes they made that forced special sessions. And that comes about because of the haste they get into toward the end of sessions, and that will probably always happen, whether they have a deadline or not. But I think it was in the mid-70s they passed a bill to revise a criminal law about on arrest procedures or something. But anyway, they made a mistake, and the law went into effect, and it said that people could not, the police agencies, law enforcement, could not disclose who was in jail publicly. And that wasn't intended, but that's what it ended up saying. And that was back in the days when bills were printed. The amendments were printed successively, and they didn't engross bills that often. So they did have separate amendments, and I remember amendments written around the sides of the bill by hand, stuff like that in the last days. And that's how that kind of bill passed. Anyway, it was funny because the bill went into effect about the time the Pendleton Roundup was held. And there were usually some over-celebrators that ended up in the Hooskow over there, and they couldn't tell wives or husbands or anybody else who was in jail. It created a big stir, and so they had to come into session and repeal it. They had another session, I think it was 73, where they passed a bill on the real estate code reform bill that had a big glitch that halted a lot of land sales for some reason by mistake. And I don't remember too much more about it. Leslie Gordon was involved with it, I remember that. He was majority leader, I think. They had to come in session and do something with that. So the special sessions are often dramatic, either because there's a big problem or like we had in the 2002 with the budget problems. The place is a lot about money, so a lot of the stories you remember about money and the budget. But those other two things are examples of things that seemed insignificant. Well, another story is, this is a story I can tell on the press, I guess, but I think it was 97 maybe, anyway, when the bill passed to make all elections by mail. All major elections by mail, at least the primary and general, by mail only. The press didn't catch it. Passed in the last 2 or 3 days, maybe the last day. And for somehow it got by everybody. Went through the chambers, and reporters didn't happen to be in the chambers when it passed, and nobody knew it. And the director of the AP's elections service, the part of our service that coordinates elections and gathers returns and election coverage, that's a big part of our job, went to some convention in the East and heard about this bill that Oregon had adopted, all mail voting, And it got back to us, and there was quite a bit of recrimination and uncomfortable times about why everybody missed that story. Well, why we in particular, but everybody else missed the story. And so a bill got through, a very significant bill got through without ever being reported on in the end. It got signed and became law, but that wasn't something that seemed insignificant. It just got missed. Well, the speed limit bill is another insignificant one that caused a hoopla, unintended consequences. You learn in this, one thing you do learn in this job is how complex the law is, and how it doesn't take much of anything to make a mistake like that, no matter how many hands it goes through, because the law is really, except for lawyers and judges, the law is more complicated than anybody realizes, and you have lay people coming in here, and lawyers work for them, but you end up compromising and trying to get an agreement on something like that, and you end up with unintended consequences, and that's happened in a number of times. Well, yeah, that's currently a pretty pervasive topic the last few sessions. There's more partisanship, but I've thought about that quite a bit, and I think that oversimplifies it. There's always partisanship. Like I mentioned in my first session, there was 16-14 makeup in the Senate, actually 16 Democrats, but Deb Potts always voted with the Republicans, so it was 15-15, and they had a 2-week deadlock for leadership. And John Burns made a deal with the Republicans, and they elected him president in that coalition. But that was, sort of the height of partisanship. So partisanship isn't new, and partisanship's how it's supposed to work, in a way. Checks and balances and all that. We'd have one party if it didn't work that way. So I understand what people are saying. I've thought about it, and I think more than partisanship, it's intransigence. It's I interviewed Governor Kulongoski a few months ago, and he mentioned something that stuck with me, and he's been pretty critical of the legislature, people know, but I think it's sort of a me win, you lose situation that's developed. And I think it's become a little bit demagogic and a little bit intransigence on both sides. And they become entrenched in positions. And I guess you can call it partisanship. But I think there's a little more to it. That's what I was trying to say. One other thing that's definitely changed is money. And money has a huge influence in politics. Everybody knows that. And it costs not only more now to run for office, especially the legislature, than when I was first started reporting it, but exponentially more. I think it's way more than inflation would account for. When I came here, you could run for a House seat for $3,000 or $4,000, $5,000. If you went over that, it was kind of you kind of stood out. Senate seat maybe $6,000 or $7,000 or something. So now when we see Senate seats at $300,000 and $400,000, the real hot ones, that's way more than inflation accounts for. It's become a business, for one thing. It's kind of a hard thing to get to analyze all the reasons for it. But there's just more people want to buy influence on both sides for whatever reason. They want more from the system. They want more from the legislature or whatever. And the political industry has become a business. It's not a grassroots thing at all anymore. It's become a very large business with consultants in advertising and public relations and campaign firms. There's consultants and firms that do nothing else, quite a lot of them year-round, and they charge a lot of money. And once one side starts spending a lot of money to get elected, the other side's got to try to match it or come pretty close. And that's kind of a corrosive influence, I think. I don't think it's a good thing. It's a fact of life in politics now, but as the state's gotten bigger and more populous, it's gotten more expensive, but that doesn't explain all of it, because and the legislature's failed to do some things that it could do to control it. I think we're one of 5 or 6 states that has no contribution limits at all. Spending limits are hard to enforce, but contribution limits the courts will uphold, but we haven't done anything about it. And we're kind of getting the black eye among people that think we need to do something about that to rein this in. It's pretty hard to control money in the system, because if you control one place, pop out the next. But that's changed a lot, and it tends to make legislators more professional politicians than citizen legislators. But costs them money to serve too, so citizen legislators have to be compensated appropriately, or you won't get people to serve. I think it can be maintained, but I think some things have to happen. I think they have to go to annual sessions, for one thing, and I think they will go to them either de facto or do it on their own motion, because otherwise, if they don't, they're going to be here until August every time, and they've developed a operating procedure here while they wait each other out and run each other down until they get agreements at the end. And we all have to have deadlines, or most of us do, to get things done. And I think they're going to have to impose deadlines themselves, or ask the voters to impose them. And the Constitution would probably be the best way. And that's the first thing, so people have some certainty on how long they're going to be here. They can tell their employers, the ones that have jobs, they can tell their law partners or whatever, instead of just drifting into through the summer with no certain adjournment. It's that system of meeting every year but shorter time seems to work in Washington State pretty well. They're more populous, they have a bigger legislature, but they meet, I think, 4 months one year and a couple months the next. They don't meet any longer in total than we do in our one session. But they have deadlines, so they get it finished. And I think that'll have to happen as the state gets bigger, or there's just going to be special sessions, or there's going to be problems in between that. And legislators put a lot of time into it. It's pretty hard to maintain a business and do it. But they've got to put some certainty in how long they're going to be here. And they probably ought to be paid more, because I think in Washington, I think they're paid $35,000, which is, last I checked, it's more than twice what they're paid here. And to compensate them just for lost business that might happen, or for out-of-pocket expenses they have. I suspect they have some, a lot of them. So I think citizens can still serve, but the ones that, except for ones that are retired or don't do anything else, the other ones have got to have more certainty. And I think the annual session thing will happen. I think they ought to consider more pay. I know President Courtney wants to go beyond that and consider other things, and maybe more broad things, general things. But like I said, I think they could benefit by going to Washington on a field trip for a couple of days and seeing how they operate up there and seeing what is sort of a indicator of how they might operate here if they went to a system, something like that. Not that we'd have to copy it wholesale, but I'd also say that the commission shouldn't set out to try to think it's going to end partisanship. And I don't think anybody thinks it's going to end it, but I don't think they even ought to set out to think they're going to ameliorate it or whatever they want to call it, because that's not going to happen. The system, partisanship makes the system work like it does and work like it's supposed to when it works well. I think they could encourage the chambers to, if they want to go in that direction, to have proportionate representation on all committees and whatnot. But I think trying to have the commission, they're talking about that, trying to have them do that is problematic, I think, because the legislature sets its own rules under the Constitution, and each session is going to set its own rules. They might be a little different than the last session, they might be the same, but I think they really ought to worry about how the place functions and how to keep interested citizens running for the legislature and accommodate them so they're able to do that, rather than worry too much about partisanship and bickering and things like that, because they're not going to end that. It tends to be cyclical. I think that the period we're in the United States now is we got blue and red states and lots of sharp divisions, and we've got lots of sharp divisions here. It's we're sort of a microcosm, and so I think they could do things that would improve the way they work, but that's the main ones, I think. They ought to limit the number of bills introduced. They're all jealous introducing bills, but there's so much, there's so many, that's duplication that it just creates confusion and inefficiency. They ought to put limits on that. They ought to, they go to annual sessions, they can have productive committees that just keep working year round. They work through the interim and work on bills seriously, rather than starting afresh with and this with new members and all. And by the time they crank up, there's only a few months left to do anything, and so that's not efficient either any longer. But as far as the time limit, I think we're the only biennial legislature left with no deadline on adjournment. We're one of only like 6 left anyway. Well, not nearly as effective as it could be for the reasons I talked about earlier. I think it's got to get a more efficient operating model than it's gotten right now. I think the legislature tries to do more and works harder than the average person realizes. I don't think the legislature gets a lot of attention, even when they're in session, from the general citizen. But I think it could be more effective with a more orderly way to meet, a more certain way to meet, more planning to it. I realize a lot of planning goes into each session, but it's not nearly as efficient as it could be. It's hard to quantify, but it takes a while to get up to speed here. I didn't understand the legislature as a rookie reporter in 1971. It probably took me 2 or 3 sessions before I understood the dynamics and the process in the place. And, I think it takes a member 2 or 3 sessions, no matter how much, information they get ahead of time, or classes or whatnot, 2 or 3 sessions to do the same thing. And when we had those kind of limits in the House, then they were gone after that. So we've had a lot of turnover and people coming in, and they just really didn't understand. It took them time to get up to speed and how it worked, and they're under a lot of pressure when they come here. Especially with the communications these days, they've got emails pouring in and all kinds of things they have to deal with constituents, plus trying to get used to this place, hordes of lobbyists, reporters asking them questions a lot, things like that. But yeah, there's nothing to be said for term limits, I don't think. And the other dynamic it would create here, if it had continued, is the Senate would have dominated the place even more than it did. The Senate, because it has more institutional memory, kind of knows the system better and knows the methods better and knows the way it works better, and they're going to have the upper hand in that kind of a system where you give House members such short terms. Somebody like Karen Mendes is an exception because she worked here for quite a while and understood the system, working for her husband. But yeah, I don't think you can equate it to partisanship or translate it into partisanship. I don't think that had much to do with it. But yeah, you don't develop leaders in a session or two. So was a problem, especially in the House. I don't know exactly how to develop leaders, so when people say there's lack of leadership, that's hard to get at, other than experience makes leaders, and that's certainly a factor. But if you start talking about what's the lack of leadership otherwise, it's hard to put your finger on. Charismatic leaders come along and have abilities that other people don't, and they end up leaders. But no, I think term limits was disruptive and didn't produce anything, and voters have the ability to limit anybody's term they want to anyway, anytime. So it's always, to me, kind of a very odd concept. Interestingly, it still applies to the top officials in the state. Reporting has changed in the techniques or in the mechanics a lot because of advanced communication. It's become much faster with computers now, banging on a typewriter, literally pasting sheets of paper together. When I started in the newspaper work, there were still linotypes. We pasted sheets of paper together, typed stories together, things like that. So it's much faster and easier. The mechanics of it, good tape recorders and all kinds of things like that. But as far as the relationships, I was asked that too the other day in an interview about have the relationships changed or our relationships with legislators. I don't think a whole lot different, except that there was more socializing in the 70s when I started in this, covering the legislature, 70s and into the 80s, after hours socializing. Reporters would go out to restaurants, and legislators, you'd always find some at most any restaurant downtown, and so you had after hours contacts with them. Whether that was good or bad, I don't know. Some it was probably fine. Some stories probably came out of it, not as many as people suspect, but it probably made a little closer relationships and maybe a better understanding of between legislators and reporters on what each other's role is. That kind of stopped because it just doesn't happen anymore. Legislators don't go out anymore. They work harder and longer hours. And there just aren't parties anymore and things like that, but very few. always helps to understand each other as human beings in all kinds of settings, rather than just the sort of formal setting we've got here. Seeing somebody in their office, or squeezing in time for an appointment, or all that, or interviewing them on the floor of the Senate of the House isn't the same. I've still got friends who are legislators that, like Ralph Gormer, for example, I've known for 30 years and got to know him because we went kind of on the circuit some nights out in the town, but they don't do that. I think they're self-conscious, too. They don't want to be seen out partying or carousing or whatnot. They're afraid somebody might report it or something. I don't know. There's sort of like a climate of that. I doubt if that much would happen, but everybody's just more serious now. There's not that atmosphere. And so that part of the relationship's different. We don't know individual legislators as well because of that, and they don't know us as well. But the process we have in our profession with them is to build trust with people. That's how you get information from them, and that's our business, or my business, is getting information. And that's how you get people to give it to you. And you've got to build trust and confidence with them, and that takes effort. And sometimes, it takes several sessions maybe sometimes. It's hard to come in here one session. I can't imagine just coming here one session and trying to build that kind of, sort of camaraderie, even though the press looks at itself as kind of arm's length from elected officials and whatnot. Still, the personal relationships are the way you really do your best job. That's always been the case. The only thing that's changed now, like I said, was socializing part of it. Occasionally, some of it is a little more maybe looking for foibles or gotcha, or what we call in the business, or something like that. But I don't think very much. I think that's always gone on. People are always going to see us as biased, depending on their bias. And any given story, news story that anybody writes in the building just about, some legislators are going to like it and some aren't. Some will think it's very good and some will think it's bad. As far as being, misleading or you can't believe it, that's unfortunate. Some reporters are more careful than others. The wire service is unique in the respect that we serve everybody, and the AP doesn't write editorials, and the AP doesn't have advertising, and so we just, we're down the middle. And so we look at ourselves as more, not that other news reporters slant things, but we have to satisfy our customers. We can't start going one way or the other, slanting stories, or we're going to make some of them mad. I think there's always been those complaints, and if it's more now, I don't know really why. Obviously, the first thing is to be straight with them, but I'll presume they want to do that. Don't get mad if your press release gets ignored. If you think it's important, follow up on it and ask why they didn't think it was important or why they didn't run it, but don't badger them about not running it, because reporters get dozens of releases every day, and especially with the advent of email, dozens of emails every day during the legislature. and they just have to pick and choose, both because of the time they've got to do it and the space that the newspapers are going to give to it. I think it used to be said that 80% of what the AP sends to a given newspaper will be thrown out because they don't have the room. You know, we put thousands of stories in the wire, and any given paper is not going to run but a small fraction. So we have to pick and choose. So, you know, try to have an understanding with the reporter on what you think is important, but don't lecture them on why you think the stuff they're doing is unimportant and theirs is more important. Or it's not so much a trust relationship, but the relationship between you won't fare too well. If you're going to send news releases, make them short, concise, and try to summarize what you want to say clearly. The longer they are, the less attention they're going to get. If you're going to have a press conference, I can get one of my gripes in, I guess. Don't bring in 30 people that are going to talk at the press conference. That's the best way to drive people away from it. Legislators tend to they've got an important bill they want to introduce, which is okay, but they tend to want to bring in 5 or 6 people that are interested with it and have them all talk. People don't have time for that. We don't have 30 or 45 minutes to listen to a bill or a cause, however worthy. Make it short and sweet. It's got limited time. Don't be offended if there aren't too many reporters in there, because some do watch it on television. They get annoyed, and it's not a good idea to go around the building trying to dragoon reporters into your press conference, because they know about it and they're either going to go or they're not. And if you become one of these people, it's going to go in and interrupt them and say, my press conference is now, and they're, you know, why aren't you there or something? That not a good thing, not a good idea. Well, I guess that's some suggestions how to deal with the press. But, you know, to ask your questions, answer them, be straight with them. If you don't know, say you don't know. Don't obfuscate things. Most legislators are well-intentioned and want to get their message out, and, you know, I could tell them to don't be afraid of us, but they are afraid of us, and I don't know how to cure that. They're afraid their story is going to get warped or somehow not put out like they want it, but we're not out to get them, you know, by and large. So, but developing an informal relationship's a good idea too, with reporters, especially that work for papers in your area, and most legislators do that when they're working with the regional papers. But yeah, drop by an office for 5 minutes and say hello, because most legislators don't do that. Some do, but there's been sessions here, I have to admit that there's been legislators come and gone that I've never talked to, and we don't tend to localize things as much because we're a statewide news service and we cover all of them, so to speak. But yeah, it's good. And the reporter, of course, can take the initiative to do that themselves. The burden's not totally on the legislator. But if there's a reporter they know that covers environmental issues for the AP or somebody else, and that's their big interest, and that's the committee they got themselves on, they ought to go strike up a conversation. I think there's a little standoffishness, and probably maybe on both sides to do that. It doesn't happen as much as it should. Prioritize what you're doing. Don't get overwhelmed. It's easy to say, but it's easy to get overwhelmed here. Everybody, I think, that's come here in the first session, no matter what they work, where they work, you or him or me, tend to get overwhelmed by the number of things going on at once. Um, so it depends on what, I don't know what the constraints on the reporter are, obviously, by their editors, what they want them to do, but I'd say you need to get acquainted with leaders. You're going to be dealing with leaders a lot, the caucus leaders and their staffs. Most of them have somebody that deals with the press. Specifically, go buy them a cup of coffee shop, get out of the office, and try to have, even though you don't socialize after hours, try to have it in a less formal setting than sitting in the office with the phone ringing and whatnot. Pick and choose your subjects, don't try to cover everything. People around here tend to try to do too much. I think some legislators try to do too much, and some reporters try to do too much. I know some reporters still that try to do too much, and they're afraid they're missing something if they don't run to every meeting. But you just have to learn not to do that, because you won't do a good job if you don't. I'd tell a new reporter to get some advice from old reporters. I think in any business you do that. You know, every time we got a reporter for the session, I'd try to help them without being intrusive, but tell them kind of how to operate to keep themselves from getting too frustrated and confused by the place. One advantage maybe in not having a deadline, and it's kind of a perverse advantage, but it's the first couple months are pretty slow. I suspect in legislatures with deadlines, they ramp up a lot faster, getting bills out and whatnot, but you have a fair amount of time here because of the way they work to do that news-wise. Honesty and straightforwardness, I think that may even go without saying. To be effective, you have to sell yourself and your ideas, and that's easier said than done, but most officials have become decent public speakers and communicators that way. Some better than others, but you have to put some effort into selling yourself and your ideas, and maybe getting advice to do that, and meet with public groups, which I know they do, but to get feedback on how well you're doing that. Prioritize. Every legislator's got individual ideas, or every public official, of things they would want to do, I think, in the government to improve the lot of people or whatever, but some try to do too much and don't narrow their focus enough. And I think the leaders that have gotten the most done have narrowed their focus. Tom McCall, for example, focused on a few things, but he focused on them very hard, and he's a good communicator, better than most by far. But public officials, elected officials, tend to try to be everything to everybody, and I think that's a mistake. I think they need to focus themselves on what they want to do and try to sell it the best they can, and they'll get support for it from the people that are going to support it, and not everybody's going to. The public perceives officials sometimes as being too wishy-washy and saying things they want to hear. So I think they need to not worry about their image so much, but realize that not everybody's going to always be for them. Communication and the ability to compromise and change your mind, and not stick to a position stubbornly when it becomes unworkable. And they change. Sometimes officials are reluctant to admit they've changed their mind or reversed directions, but everybody changes their mind about things. There's nothing wrong with that. It's better just to explain why you're doing it than to try to stick to some position that's not tenable any longer. I'm being kind of amorphous about that, I guess, but that's the elements I see of being successful in office. I think of some, I've known so many that legislators that it's hard to single out some, but Norma Paulus is one of the best speakers I've ever heard here. Norma gave a really stirring speech. I remember when we ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. Of course, the states never did ratify it totally, but Oregon actually ratified it twice, but the first time we ratified it, she gave a very dramatic speech. Very good speaker. And she's an example of somebody that's very candid and straightforward. Maybe too candid for own good a few times, but anyway. I'm going back to the 70s again, but Dave Frohmeyer is a really good communicator. People listen to. Grattan Cairns was a good speaker that people listen to, would stop and listen to. Peter Courtney is one of the best. Melodramatic sometimes, but he's an orator. There's no question about that. People listen to him. In the Senate, Len Hannon was a speaker that had kind of a folksy, plain-spoken style, but people respected him, and he was a straightforward speaker, and people stopped and listened to him. I think in the job I had, you realize how much government touches everything that happens in the state, and how much it touches people directly and indirectly, and how it operates to affect people. Most people deal with, I think a lot of people in their lifetime deal with the DMV and maybe the Revenue Department and get a fishing license. Beyond that, don't have a lot of dealings with the state government. They don't realize how much it does to help people. Places like the Human Resources Department, I think I got years of reporting, made me understand there's a lot of people that try to help people over there and really work hard at it. And the public, of course, sees this as a faceless bureaucracy because they don't have much experience with it, don't know people inside of it and really what they do. And sometimes people would say, well, the negative comes out in the news because that's what makes news sometimes, and that's true. But there's a lot more positive news that comes out than people realize. But anyway, I realize it's much bigger than the average citizen thinks it is. Bigger and more complicated. As far as relating to the legislature, I realize that it takes a long time to effect change in it. Very seldom does anything happen in one session that affects a big change in the government. It takes several sessions, takes years. Change the way things operate. But I don't think people really realize the state government's involved in so many things, the size and complexity of it. It's kind of like I just said about the state government. The legislature, of course, is the state government in one sense, and the legislature does things that affect everybody. Everybody in the state, every session does something that affects just about everybody. And so they ought to be concerned about that. If they don't like it, they ought to react to it. Instead of ignoring it until there's something surprises them later after the legislature's over and they didn't know the legislature did that. Legislature poses a lot of requirements on them. Legislature makes them go slow in school zones at 3 in the morning, stuff like that. And the legislature charges them fees and taxes. The legislature requires them to file lots of papers when they want to go into business. The legislature does hundreds of things that potentially affect groups of citizens, or most of us. And the time to have your voice heard, and your voice does get heard. I think people don't misconstrue that. This state is not so huge that your voice doesn't get heard if you complain about something. And actually there's more people come here and testify and contact legislators than I think the public realizes, or I think even reporters realize till they get here. There are a lot of people that come here, travel here to support something or complain about something. I think they are doing it, and you're getting to it with the improvement in communications. You're making more video available, I think is, I don't know everything you're doing, but you're making more video available on the internet, closed circuit at remote sites, things like that. And the more pervasive communication you can get, I think the more interested people will become. Some people will never be interested, but improvements in communications are a big part of it. What the legislature can do beyond that, I'm not sure. To stimulate interest, I think the trips by committees around the state this session were a good idea. I think if they went to annual sessions, they could coordinate that so it was kind of a continuum, keeping the same basic committees or maybe melding a couple and having it become sort of a fixture in people's mind that the legislature is there to explain what it's doing and hear your complaints or whatever, you know, and do that more regularly than just showing up here for 6 months or whatever, and then the 3/4 of the 2-year period kind of being less visible. People need that input. And that's a good way to bring the legislature to people and stir some more interest, I think. I would hope it would do that. I don't know. But I think whether it does anything concrete is another matter. That's not really the purpose of the meeting. I don't think the purpose is just to get the information from the public on what they want, what ones will turn out. And unfortunately, I suspect some of these meetings, the usual suspects are the ones that turn out. But I think you get the average citizens do turn out too, and I think if the legislature got on this better schedule, what I think would be a better schedule, I think the public had come to expect that it was going to do that, and it'd make itself more visible. And I think that's what, for example, what Courtney wants to do, if I'm reading him right. And the people just ought to be interested in what the government's doing, or not doing, for that matter. And that's our job, to tell them that, try to tell them that. I'll differentiate between the levels of staff. I'm thinking of two kinds: the leadership staff, and I think all the caucus offices and the two top offices have people that deal with the press now, specifically. I mean, there's ins and outs sometimes. They come and go, but that helps things a lot to have somebody that we can sit down to and tell our needs and kind of knows how, maybe even hopefully has some experience in knowing how we work. Yeah, staffs can be invaluable because legislators' time is jammed up. You see legislators caught on the floor by reporters much of the time when they want to ask them questions because they're just appointments are too jammed up in their offices. So staff can facilitate that. I found committee staffs can be really helpful, especially the ones that have been here for a while and questions about bills, because they often know as much or more than the legislators and the committee do about them. The revenue and fiscal offices are real helpful places. Good to work with. Now, can some be obstacles? Yeah, there are some. There are obstacles, and the reason they're obstacles is they want to shield their leaders from too much exposure, and I think it's the leaders that want to be shielded. I don't think staff very often does things that their bosses don't want them to do, and sometimes I think staff has gotten unfairly blamed for things that I don't think most staff people go out and operate on their own. But at any rate, yeah, sometimes they can be roadblocks. Trying to get access to the leaders, and they don't want us to. They want to speak for them instead, and they don't say very much. And it just won't satisfy editors a lot of times to just have spokespeople. No matter how knowledgeable they are, they want comments from the person about an issue that's, hot and pending or whatever. So the staff member very often will quote a staff member as a spokesman or spokeswoman, but mainly for us, they're facilitators. But yeah, we need to talk to the person sometimes, and there's some, I don't know, I probably shouldn't name them, but there's a couple around here that put up a wall really hard to get through, and you can wear them down if you just hound them and hound them. No special plans really. I'm going to think about it. I didn't retire with the idea that I was going on to anything different. The only thing I've told anybody is I'm going to take part in Common Cause's stuff. I think I believe in I support their efforts, good government efforts, or whatever you want to call them, in general. And they're a group I think that should be stronger than it is. And so I've told them I'd like to. They invited me to speak a few weeks ago, so before I retired, and I went and talked to them about the session. But I think I'd like to do some of that, maybe some other volunteer stuff, and I'll probably write some stuff. Got writing in my blood, so I don't know if it'll be freelance or, every writer says they'll write a novel. He's going to try it. I don't know if I'm going to do that, but. I like to write. I like to research things. I like to write about them, and I've liked that all my life. So I'll do some of that. I hope we can travel some. But, I'd like to take part in some volunteer stuff too, like that, Common Cause, and maybe even show up down here and testify someday. Who knows? Something that really grips me.